Thank you very much, Ellie. And it's always a pleasure to come together here, um, learn some Torah together on a Tuesday morning, Beit Knesset Anasi. My guess is that some of you participated in the program the other evening with Rabbi Wine, which was a commemorative program for Rabbi Sachs and Rabbi Feinstein. I'm going to try and not sort of duplicate a lot of the material that I mentioned then, but what I'd like to do really today is to take one or two ideas about Sefer Bereishit from the writings of Rabbi Sachs and discuss them and outline what was unique about it. Because there's no question that Rabbi Sachs had a unique vocabulary and a unique perspective in his teaching of Torah. And in many ways, many of us, his friends and his colleagues, we were sort of admirers of him and occasionally maybe a bit jealous of his genius and his scholarship. Jealous only in the positive sense, of course, what Chazal call kinat sofrim, right? Kinat sofrim is Chazal say is a positive jealousy. You're allowed to be jealous of people who are doing good things because that spurs you on to try and emulate them in certain ways. And Rabbi Sachs was certainly like that. He also was. Rabbi Sachs also had very interesting observations about life and rabbinic life, particularly. I don't know if I mentioned to you, but in one of we used to have the chief rabbis pre-Yomim Naroim conference every year where Rabbi Sachs addressed Rabbonim. And in one of them, I remember that he was speaking to Rabbonim and he was saying that one has to be, as a Rav or a teacher or anybody who stands up in public office, how careful you have to be with your demeanor, with the way you present yourself to your listeners. Because very often, maybe even subconsciously, people will look at you and you are, in a sense, I think the phrase he used was, you were like the shop store window. You're the window for Judaism and for Jewish life. And therefore, if the rabbi gets up and he's a bit unfriendly and a bit critical and overly judgmental, and he says silly things, people don't think, oh, he's a silly man and he says silly things and he's ungrateful, he's unwelcoming. People think that Judaism is silly, that Judaism is unwelcoming. And therefore you have to realize when you get up, when you are, and this is not just about Rabbonim, any religious person working in the broader context of society, you're representative in a certain sense. And he had a very interesting name for this principle. He said he used to call this the principle of Mare Koyen. You remember the piyut on Yom Kippur, Emes Male Heda Hoyo Mare Kohen. What is that about? It's about the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur coming out of the Kodesh Kodoshim. And Chazal say if he came out and he was radiant and happy, then the whole of Klal Yisrael were celebrating. That was a wonderful. Why is that? He said, because if the Kohen Gadol was radiant, the onlookers didn't think, oh, the Kohen Gadol is having a good day today. He must be feeling good. They didn't think that. They looked at the Kohen Gadol and they said, oh, the Kohen Gadol is radiant. It must mean that HaKadosh Baruch Hu loves us, that our Yom Kippur is valuable, is working, that we are connected to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So his ponim, his mare, right, the mare ponim of the mare kohen, the way he looked, actually carried a message. And that is true about all of us in broader context, and particularly maybe about Rabbonim and social leaders when they get up to represent, to teach Torah, that it's so important to make sure. And I mention this particularly about Rabbi Sachs because some of you might know, maybe not, but I certainly knew him before he became a famous rabbi. And he actually started off his life as an academic, as a Cambridge philosophy academic, and that was his plan in life, to go down that direction. I won't go into that for the moment, but what was interesting was, once he made a decision to go into Rabbanus, he changed his personality by the force of his brain, by the force of his decision. He decided that he can't do the work that he wants to do by being an introvert and a private individual. He has to become more pastoral and more mu'urav im habrios and more connected and concerned about people. And he literally changed his whole demeanor and changed his midas. He was a very interesting example of a sort of a person who is able to change his personality. To certainly, he always remained to a certain extent introverted and private, but he managed to create a different persona, which radiated out to his colleagues and to the UK Jewish community, and eventually on the world stage. But that was really something that he created through the power of his mind and his personality, and he really achieved amazing things. I'll just share with you one very interesting line. I don't think I'd mentioned the other evening. He had some very good insights. So I remember once I think it was at a simcha of some sort, sitting around and with various rabbonim, and one of the rabbonim asked him, how do you deal with all these accolades, all these compliments that you get all the time, Lord, Professor, Sir, and all the different articles that are written about, how do you deal with all these compliments? Does it not go to your head? So I remember he said a very good line. He said, compliments are not a bad thing. You get compliments. It's encouraging. It oils the wheels of society, giving people compliments. But he says, one thing I want to tell you: when somebody gives you a compliment, don't inhale. That's what, when you hear a compliment, you're allowed to hear it, but don't inhale. And I just thought that was just such an interesting use of English, of the words. Don't inhale. In other words, don't take it too seriously. Don't breathe deep. So yes, it's a nice compliment, and move on. Don't inhale your compliment. And I thought that was just a very astute observation about somebody in public life who's doing well and gets lots of compliments. But the danger always is that compliments can make somebody a bit of an egomaniac. And one of the qualities of Rabbi Sachs was he remained a very modest person. He was just very modest in his personal life and his interaction with people and his interaction with colleagues and everybody. He was a modest person, despite the fact that he was on the world stage and he was a world-known voice and a world-renowned author. He remained a modest person. And that was really, apart from all the other great achievements of his, I consider that to be something worth remarking upon when we're still in, a difficult time. I must tell you, the whole of the UK jury and world jury, many people are really devastated by his loss. And as I mentioned at the Hesped, the truth is that it's not just Rabbi Sachs, but this year we lost Rabbi Steinsaltz, Zechron Livracha, and we also lost Rav Nachum Rabinovitz, who was in the Hesder Yeshivas, one of the most prominent voices, and we lost Rabbi Norman Lamb from Yeshiva University, and Zalman Nechemia Goldberg. It has been a very sad day for Jewish religious leadership all round. And I think it requires of us to really resolve to generate a new generation of religious leaders to take their place. Okay. What I'd like to do this morning and have a look at a pasuk in Parshas Noach, which is interesting on lots of different levels. And I want to try and see what Rabbi Sachs does with this pasuk. In fact, just with one word. He takes one word out of one pasuk in Parshas Noach, and he develops it into a major theme. And this was really, I would say, methodologically, one of his great skills, to be able to take what seems to be a narrative which we're all familiar with and to drill down deep into it to find an idea, which then he expands the idea into a major issue in Jewish life. So that was, if I had to really try and typify or in some way describe what his one of his important contributions to Torah, this would be one of it. Okay, so I'm going to try and share a screen. I always say a little tefillah, but I try sharing a screen because it doesn't always work. How are we doing? Yes? Ellie, can you see it? Yes? Can you see the screen? Thank you. Okay. Okay, let's read a few psukim. Psukim familiar to us from the story of Noach, and I'll eventually get to the one word which is going to be the focal point. It starts off, of course, where Yomer Lekim Noach, God says to Noach, Kate's called Bosa Bola Fonai, right? The world has disintegrated into violence and immorality, and I'm going to destroy them. In other words, this is really, in a sense, the whole story of Noach, if we're talking about themes in Sefer Bereishit. So Bereishit and Noach is about creation, followed by destruction, followed by recreation. In other words, Noach is, in a sense, a Mark II Adam HaRishon. Noach then becomes a new founder of mankind. Adam was supposed to be the founder of mankind, but mankind disintegrated morally so badly that there had to be a destruction and a recreation of a new world. Okay, but let's have a look. So what does he say to him? Asay lecha tevas atzei gofa. Make for yourself the ark, the famous Noah's ark. And it's pay attention that the word for the ark is the word teva, right? In actual fact, teva in general Hebrew simply means a box, really, right? In the modern Hebrew as well. Tevat doar is a post box, right? A teva is a box, right? But we find the word teva here to mean not just a box, but actually a boat, which is used to preserve life and to save mankind. Interestingly, and this may be a subject for a share, I'll give it at a later point, there's an interesting connection here to another teva. Does anyone know where there was another teva mentioned in the Torah? Which other narrative story has a teva? So the answer is that Moshe Rabbeinu's mother puts him as a small child into a teva, into a little box on the River Nile. Right? The story of Moshe as a baby being put on the River Nile and later on Basia picking him up, that is, there the word teva appears again. And interestingly, in a similar sort of context, it's not just any old box, it's a box designed to preserve something which is very precious. To guarantee the future of the Jewish people, you needed Moshe Rabbeinu, and to guarantee the future of mankind, you needed Noach, his family, and the animal kingdom. Anyhow, when it comes to, we'll come back to that maybe later on. When it comes to making the ark, so we're first given the dimensions, right? How many amos it was, 300 amos by 50 by 30, okay? Won't go into that for the moment. And here comes a very interesting detail. We're not given much details about this ark. You know, was it furnished? Was it not furnished? Or how did they manage, etc., etc.? But one thing is mentioned specifically, and that is this word tzohar. Tzadi hey resh. Tzohar ta'aseh teva. Make for the teva a tzohar. And what, right? And the question is, what in heaven's name is a tzohar? A Hebrew word which doesn't appear anywhere else. It's a unique Hebrew word. Chazal understood that it had something to do with light, right? It's associated with the Hebrew word zohar, which means radiance, which we are familiar with. And we also are familiar with that the word in Hebrew for midday is tzoharayim. Tzoharayim, okay? So in modern Hebrew, for example, you'd say about the morning is sometimes called lifnei atzarayim and the afternoon is achrei atzarayim, right? Tzoharayim means midday. So tzohar means light, okay? So make a tzohar for the teva. What was this tzohar? So those people who are Rashi followers know that there's this is a few paragraphs I've got here out of Rabbi Sachs's things. Amid all the drama of the impending flood and the destruction of almost all of creation, we focus on Noah building the ark, and we hear one detailed instruction: make a tzohar for the ark. Says Rabbi Sachs, we don't know what the word soha means. So let's look at Rashi. So Rashi says, here's Rashi. Here's one line in Rashi. I have to decode it for you a little bit. So Rashi says, first says Yud Aleph. Yud Aleph means Yesh Omrim. Yesh Omrim means there's one opinion. That soha means chalon. Right, you got this, chalon. Chalon means it could be simply a window. Make a window to let the light in. V'yesh Omrim, but there's another opinion, which is Even Tova HaMeira Lohem. Some sort of a precious stone that was radiant and provided light inside the teva without any windows being open. In other words, according to the second opinion, the teva was sealed shut. There was no light coming in from outside. So how did they live in total darkness? Right? You couldn't live for all that time, for months and months, close to a year, according to Rashi, in total darkness. How is that possible? You can only do it if you have some illumination. Where's the illumination come from? According to the second opinion, so he says here, Rashi quotes a medrash in which two rabbis disagree as to its meaning. Some say it was a window, others say it was a precious stone that gave light to them, right? And the precious stone had this miraculous quality of being able to generate light in the darkness. Okay, so far so good. We've got one word, sohar. We've got two possible meanings for the word sohar, and that's where we're up to after we've learned the pasuk with Rashi. The Bartanura also develops Rashi a little bit, says some of the things I mentioned to you before, the connection to Tzoharayim. Right, the Bartanura mentions the word Tzoharayim. That must mean a skylight of some sort or a precious stone. Comes along the Chizkuni. The Chizkuni is one of the later Rishonim, who gives a slightly different nuance to this debate. But you'll see later on what Rabbi Sachs does with this. That's why I brought the Chizkuni here, because it's interesting. Chizkuni says that when you read Rashi like this, it isn't an either-or Rashi. The Chizkuni and others suggest that Noah had both. That what the pasuk is saying is in other words, the meaning is by using a word which was ambiguous, right? The ambiguity of the word, right, is itself significant. That it could mean a window or it could mean a precious stone, right? It means, as a Chizkuni, that actually both were present in the teva. There had to be a window, he says, a window from which he later on released the raven, right? So he had to have some work. And also he had some form of internal lighting for the period of the flood itself, when the sun was completely overcast by clouds and shrouded in darkness. In other words, sometimes the outside world was so black and dark that there was no light coming from the outside, so then you needed internal lighting. But he also had a window to let in. Okay, so far so good. We've already now know a little bit more. We've got a pasuk, that's stage one. We have Rashi with the debate in Chazal, internal light or external light. We have the Chizkuni who was saying it probably means both, right? So it has a nuance. Which is of significance. So I want to point out though that Rabbi Sachs, when he, in all his Divrei Torah, right, he's got an interesting phrase about how we read the Chumash. So he says we can read the Chumash with a microscope, what he calls reading with a microscope, which means looking at every little detail. What does actually this word mean in its exact analysis down to the smallest detail? He says some people read the Chumash historically, that it's simply giving us a narrative of things that happened. He says we want to learn the Torah covenantally. This was his phrase. We want to learn Chumash covenantally. What does that mean, covenantally? That the Chumash is part of the covenant, part of the bris between us and HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and every pasuk in the Chumash is part of that covenant. And covenantally means to read the Chumash in a way that every pasuk, even though it might be describing a technical detail, is actually telling us something about how are we supposed to live in God's world. How are we supposed to live in the best way possible in front of God? Now, the truth is he didn't invent this idea, right? This idea was really a central theme of all of the Gedolei HaChasidus. If you read the Gedolei HaChasidus, you read, for example, I'm particularly a big fan of the Sfas Emes, who was the great leader of the Gera Hasidim in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Sfas Emes wrote a commentary on Shas and a commentary on the Chumash, which is a masterpiece. And he also looks at every pasuk from the point of view of not just what was it saying about the events that happened at that time, thousands of years ago, but why would the Torah tell us this? There must be a message for us which is important for our avodat Hashem. At the end of the day, the readership of the Chumash are meant to be people like you and me who are concerned about living a life of avodat Hashem, of serving God. What is it about, so now coming back into our pasuk here, what is it about the light source in the Teva which could at all have any relevance to our avodas Hashem? Right? So that is really what Rabbi Sachs is trying to do. And because specifically it has an ambiguity to it, that makes it more interesting. If it's got an ambiguity, so you tend to think, well, an ambiguity in the word so, I mean, simply we don't know exactly what it means. And that's not the right way to learn it. An ambiguity means the Torah meant to use a word which was ambiguous to give us, right, a message which has two different layers of meaning to it, which work at the same time, right? This is not by chance, but that's part of the nuance of the Torah. Did I ever mention to you, I don't know, I mentioned, I've spoken several times about Rabbi Sachs recently. Rabbi Sachs had a thing about the word nuance. He loved the word nuance. And that the nuance, did I tell you this line of his? He had a fantastic line about the nuance. He said this once to a very big audience. He said, let me tell you something about the word nuance. Where does the word nuance come from? He says, I'll tell you where it comes from. It's very simple. He says, Yankel meets Beryl in the shtetl. And he says to him, nu, right? And Beryl says, nu. And Yankel says to him, nu. So he says to him, nu. That's the conversation. That's the conversation between two Yidden, and from that conversation developed the word nuance. A nuance is the unspoken message. That's what he says. It's when a Yid says nu, it can mean all sorts of things, right? Nu can mean not too bad. Nu can mean get on with it. Nu can mean anything, right? So the word nu and Jews bouncing back the nu and the nu, that is a nuance. That was Rabbi Sachs's unique humorous, I hasten to add, interpretation of where the English word nuance comes from. It comes from Jews knowing each other. Okay. He used to say that when the Lubavitcher Rebbe told him that he has to go into Rabbanus and help Anglo Jewry, what really the Lubavitcher Rebbe was saying to him, nu, was a big nu. Nu means get on with it. Right? He understood that nu meant to him get on with it, that he wasn't supposed to be an academic. He had to become a teacher of Torah. Anyhow, coming back to our Tzohar and our ambiguous words, let's see how he takes this further. Okay, so first of all, he does something interesting. He says, it remains fascinating to ask why the rabbis of the Medrash and Rashi himself would spend time on a question that has no practical relevance, since God had promised there'll be no new flood. Which is a very polite way of saying, okay, we've read Rashi and the Chizkuni, but who cares? Who cares whether it was a light from outside, the light from inside? Why should it matter, he says? What source of illumination Noah had? Why does that matter to us? Why is that in the Torah? So here comes his interpretation, which has, if you like, three stages to it. In this Dvar Torah by Sachs, there are three stages. The first stage is he takes the word teva, which means the ark, and he develops it. He says, the answer I suggest lies in the history of the Hebrew language. Throughout the biblical era, the word teva meant an ark, a large one in the case of Noah and the flood, and a small one in the case of the basket for Moshe Rabbeinu, right? More generally, it means a box, right? So, however, by the time of the Medrash, teva had also come to mean the word, right? In Mishnaic Hebrew, in later Hebrew, the word teva meant words, right? Tevot are words on a page. A teva is a word. So he said, if so that's stage number one. Stage number one is to expand the meaning of the teva, that it doesn't just mean the ark, but it means also a word. And I must tell you that this idea is in the Sfas Emes already. The Sfas Emes already does this, and the Gedolei Hasidus do this already, that the teva is the word, right? And in a sense, Noach is, if you like, escaping into the word of God. The teva in this context is the word of God, which protects Noach and the animal kingdom and protects mankind despite the destruction that is going on around them. And the escaping into the teva, escaping into the word, is a theme that you find in Hasidus in general. Okay, so it says, it seems to me, okay, so stage number two is, so if teva means a word, meaning the word of the Torah, now let's have a look at this debate in Rashi. Is it light from the outside or light from the inside? It seems to me the rabbis of the Medrash were not so much commenting on Noah and the ark as they were reflecting on a fundamental question of Torah. Where and what is the tzohar, the brightness, the source of illumination for the teva, for the words of Torah itself? Does it come solely from within? Does the light of the Torah come completely from within, that you could be hermetically sealed off to the outside world and generate only the light of the Torah from within, or also from without? Or do you want to bring in light from the outside? Does the Torah come with a window or with a precious stone? So I want you to pay attention to what's going on here. These divrei Torah need some reflection. He's going to spell it out in a minute. But he's saying, really, throughout history, there has been this debate. This debate of Rashi, was it a window, was it a precious stone, is really the reflection of a major question which Jews have asked themselves throughout the ages. In order to understand the truth of the Torah and the beauty of the Torah and the meaning of Judaism, do I need any light from the outside? Light from the outside means light from Chochmat HaGoyim, from the science, the philosophy, the political theory, from all the intuitions and understanding of psychology and social science. That, he says, is the light from the outside, the Chochmas HaGoyim. Do we need to study their mathematics and physics and geometry and chemistry in order to complete the picture of the wisdom of the Torah? Or are we able to sit in a cave, like Rav Shimon Bar Yochai sat in a cave with his son Elazar for 13 years and completely blanked out the non-Jewish world and just focused deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper into the Torah and found all the illumination from within? That's the principle of the precious stone. The precious stone is the light within. The window is the light outside, is the philosophy and the science and the psychology which you can get from the Umot HaOlam, from nations of the world. And if you let it come and shine through the window onto the teva, or the word of the Torah, then you can illuminate the Torah by using external wisdom. That, he says, is the question. The question that Rashi gives us about the two meanings of the Tzohar, the ambiguity which is built into the Tzohar, is a major debate which has gone through Jewish history and still alive today. It's still alive, as we all know, it's today, right? There are many yeshivot and many Orthodox people, I include myself in that, who have spent a lot of time learning Torah and yeshivas, but combine it with non-Jewish philosophy and non-Jewish psychology and non-Jewish wisdom from non-Jewish sources, and we find the combination to be particularly enlightening. That we use the light from the outside to deepen and enhance our knowledge of Torah. Other people who you'll come to, I've got lots of colleagues like that. I have quite a few colleagues who are absolutely devastated and angry with me that I went to university. That I grew up in a more Haredi environment, and I went to Haredi yeshivas, and only after about 7-8 years in Haredi yeshivas, I decided to go to university and study philosophy. By that time, I was really firmly rooted in the Haredi yeshiva world, and my chavrusas were horror-struck. What are you doing going to university? University is Tuma. University is Drek. University is the Goyim. It's something we don't want to know anything about. What can they possibly add to all the beautiful Torah you've learned in yeshiva for 8 years? Why in heaven's name would you need to go and study Aristotle and Plato and even Chas v'Shalom Spinoza? And you're going to study all this nonsense. What are you doing it for? Right? And they were not. I lost a couple of friends over this, but I knew what I was doing, and I felt very strongly that my knowledge of Torah would benefit greatly from combining it with secular studies, as indeed Rabbi Sachs did. But in the Haredi, so-called Haredi world, particularly in Israel, I would say the Haredi world in Israel is has got a different view on this completely. I say in Israel because, for example, 3 of my sons I sent to a yeshiva in America, to the Ner Yisrael yeshiva in Baltimore, which is a Haredish yeshiva, and they all spent many, many years there, 5, 6, 7 years there, 8 years there. But that yeshiva has a Haredi base of medrash from 7 in the morning till 7 in the evening. And then after 7 in the evening, the boys, if they want to, they can go a mile down the road to the Johns Hopkins University and take night school and get degrees in the Johns Hopkins University while they're learning in yeshiva. And the yeshiva's happy about that. Yeshiva encourages it. Not all the boys do it. I would say only about 50% of the boys do it. In the base of medrash, there are 500-600 young men. And it looks like Ponovich, it looks like the Mir. But in the evening, they have night school at university, and they don't feel that that's a contradiction. All it means is the yeshiva, at the end of the day, produces lawyers, doctors, dentists, computer technicians, scientists, who are all B'nai Torah, but haven't spent years and years on campus. They've got all their knowledge from night school. And that is something which is, I think, America today is unique. I don't think in the whole of Europe or in Israel is there anything remotely like that, right? But in America, there are yeshivas which certainly do validate this approach. So Rabbi Sachs here is saying that approach is the approach of that the tzohar was the chalon, that the light comes from the outside in, and the result is excellent. There are other yeshivas, particularly Hasidic yeshivas and other Israeli Haredi yeshivas, which take the view that no, you've got to block out outside light. That's only confusing. You can get lost in the non-Jewish teachings. You can lose the Torah, and this is an amazing debate. Actually, I want to tell you there was an interesting. I'll just tell you one small interesting application of this debate before I continue Rabbi Sachs's Torah, and that is. In the 1500s, in Krakow. Krakow is one of the centers of Jewish life. Some of you might have visited Krakow. And you know, of course, that one of the most important people there was the Ramah, Rav Moshe Isserlis. Rav Moshe Isserlis, who there's a shul there of the Ramah, and he's buried there. And in the early 1500s, he was the posek of Ashkenaz of Europe. What is not so well known is that he wasn't actually the most senior Rav in Krakow. The most senior Rav in Krakow was the Maharshal, Rabbi Shlomo Luria, who was the Rosh Yeshiva. So imagine that you've got the Rosh Yeshiva, the Maharshal, who is the senior, older and more experienced and massively knowledgeable in Krakow. And then you have the Ramah, who was a younger man, the Rav of the community, but he was the posek. For some reason, Klal Yisrael decided that it was the psak of the Ramah that they wanted to hear. They didn't come to they went to the Marshal for hearing his lomdus and his Talmudic acumen. And in fact, the commentary, so the Marshal wrote a commentary called the Yam Shel Shlema on the whole of Shas, which is a masterpiece. The Ramah never wrote anything on Shas. He was writing halachas. Okay. What is interesting about this is that we have quite a bit of correspondence between these two people. In the Shilas and Shuvas of the Ramah and the Marshal, we see exchanges of letters. In one letter, you'll see the point in 1 minute. In one letter, the Ramah, Moshe Isserlis, is trying to argue his case to the Marshal, and he brings a proof from the Medrash and from the Gemara and from the Tosefta, and then he quotes Aristotle. He quotes Aristotle in the paragraph of his debate. He says, as this is well known also in Aristotle, this, that, and the other, this is, and he sends this letter off to the Marshal. Anyhow, he gets in reply a nuclear, what you might call a mishaberach from the Marshal. He says, what are you sending me letters mixing up, kosher and treif and tumah and tara and kodesh and chol in the same paragraph? What, Aristotle? Are you kidding me? You're mentioning Aristotle next to the Gemara in one paragraph? You're out of your mind. What are you bringing it? Who wants to hear about Aristotle? It's all puh. It's all tumah, right? That was the Marshal's response. But the Ramah answers him a very calm letter. He said, I don't know what you're getting so excited about. He says, this was always a debate in Klal Yisrael, whether to include secular wisdom with your Torah wisdom. And I follow the Rambam on this, and you follow Rashi on this, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with this debate. We didn't invent this debate. There are two schools of thought about this. And so Rasak says these two schools of thought are the two opinions in Rashi about what a tzohar is. Do we want light from the outside, or is it all the Marshal was a person who believed in what we would call today the Haredi Torah-only experience. Exclusive Torah, you don't need any other wisdom at all. Don't learn science, don't learn philosophy, don't learn literature, other wisdoms. It's all nonsense, it's all tumah. We're only learning Kedusha. That is the internal light principle that Rashi lived by. You'll never ever hear Rashi quoting a non-Jewish source. Never. Rashi lives in a hermetically sealed world where he's not in touch with any non-Jewish authors or thinkers or of any sort whatsoever. The contrast is the Rambam. The Rambam was very upfront about this. The Rambam says, look, my writings are a combination of the wisdom of the Torah plus the wisdom of the Ummah Ha'olam, right? And the Rambam has a line which he uses in his introduction to Pirkei Avos, which became famous, which was Kabel es ha'emes mimisha omra. You've got to accept the truth irrespective of its author. What's important is the emes. And if Aristotle sells the truth or Plato sells the truth, then we've got to incorporate it in our search for truth and wisdom. Because what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants from us is to become people of wisdom. The other school of thought is HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't want us to become people of wisdom, wants us to become people of Torah. That's it. It's Torah exclusively, nothing else at all. What's interesting here about why is Rabbi Sachs's Devar Torah so interesting? Is because he's taken a posuk with a Rashi and a Chizkuni and everything, and which seems to be a simple textual comment on how the ark was built, and suddenly he's turned it into a seminar on the relationship between Torah knowledge and secular subjects. And somehow that is, and I think that was one of his, and I'm going to bring you in future shiurim also some other examples of this, because I think this is one of his real great skills to expand the idea. This is what he says here. He says, certainly there were those that who believed that Torah was self-sufficient. If something is difficult in Torah, it's because the words of Torah are sparse in one place, but rich in another place. That's a quote from a Gemara, actually. Divrei Torah aniyim b'makom echad v'ashirim b'makom acher. In other words, if you don't know what a Mishnah means, then it's because you haven't learned enough Mishnayos. Learn more Mishnayos, and you'll find in another Mishnah, the key to what the earlier Mishnah meant. In other words, the Torah is a self-contained system. And then he quotes the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos, hafochba, to turn it over and over, to kulodba, because everything is within it. So the Torah-only perspective takes the view you don't need any other help learning Torah. You just learn Torah and you'll see it's all there. Right? Rabbi Sachs concedes, he says this is probably the majority view, considered historically, that nothing of value is to be learned outside the Torah. The Torah is illuminated by a precious stone that generates its own light. This is even hinted at the title of the greatest work of Jewish mysticism, the Zohar. Right? So the Zohar is, as I mentioned before, was written in a cave. completely blocked off from any other sources. And the more that the Zohar and Kabbalistic ideas entered into Jewish thought in the last 500 years, the more the emphasis has been on the Torah-only system, and that everything else is Tumah, right? However, he says, there were, however, other views, right? And these are the views who held that the Zohar is a window. Most famously, Maimonides, that a knowledge of science and philosophy, a window to the outside world, was essential to understanding God's word. I want you to understand what this means. He's not saying that in addition to Torah knowledge, the Rambam isn't saying in addition to Torah knowledge, it's a good idea to know science and philosophy. He's saying much, much more than that. He's saying you will not understand the Torah properly unless you use also the tools provided by the maths, geometry, science, and philosophy of the non-Jewish world. You won't even understand Torah properly, because Torah requires, in the language of Rabbi Sachs's metaphor here, requires light coming in from the outside into the teva, into the word of the Torah. Only then will the teva, the word of the Torah, be illuminated by getting light from the outside. You won't get, it's not self-sufficient. It needs chokhmah from the outside. The Rambam's view was very radical in this. Right? If you read the first part of the Moreh Nevuchim, it will tell you that we can't actually learn Chumash at all without first clarifying our philosophical knowledge, because our philosophical knowledge informs the way we will learn Chumash, the way we will learn Torah. We have to clarify what our emunah is. What do we mean when we say we believe in God and God the creator? What was creation? How God relates to the world? We need philosophers to help us with that. Then we can engage with Chumash, and then we can understand it properly. So it is the light coming from the outside for the Rambam, which is absolutely crucial, as opposed to the Mekubalim and other worlds who take the view that no, light from the outside is only dangerous. It's only confusing, right? At best, it's unnecessary, but at worst, it's confusing and dangerous. And these, he said, these two views, and I think this is very fascinating. Rabbi Sachs here is not saying what's right and what's wrong here. He's saying this is a debate. That's the Rambam made the radical suggestion. The Rambam made the radical suggestion, Hilchos Seder Torah, that it's precisely these forms of study that are the way to love and fear of God, right? The Rambam writes that there is a mitzvah of Ahavat Hashem and Yirat Hashem, love and fear of God, and the way to get there is by studying science and philosophy, and that will give you a massive appreciation of the greatness of God and the wisdom of God, right? This is all the Rambam. Through science, the knowledge of He who spoke and called the universe, we gain a sense of the majesty and beauty, the infinite scope and intricate detail of creation and of the creation. In other words, in order to reach Avas Hashem, says the Rambam, you have to see the Chochmat HaBoreh, the wisdom of the Borei Olam. You have to know about the galaxies, and you have to know about the human cell and the DNA and photosynthesis and how the world works. And then you will gain a much deeper understanding of the Chochmas HaBoreh, and that will help you Avas Hashem. Right? So for the Rambam, the mitzvahs of the Torah themselves required. Right? The case Maimonides made in the 12th century, long before the rise of science, has been compounded 1,000 times with our accelerated knowledge of the nature of the universe. Each new discovery of the vastness of the cosmos and the wonders of the microcosmos fills the mind with awe. And he's saying, if this was true for the Rambam with medieval science, kal v'chomer, how much more so it's true with the knowledge of science that we have today, right? To see the incredible wonders of the of biology, of the human cell, of replication of the DNA and genetics and the immune system, and as well as all the galaxies that Chazal didn't even know about. So he says, okay, I'm going to go. So as far as the Rambam was concerned, what were secular sciences? They were simply a window through which the light of God's universe could help us decode the Torah itself. Understanding God's world helps us understand God's word. That's his punchline here in this Torah. that God's world we understand through things like philosophy, psychology, social science, and mathematics and science, and that will help us understand the world, right? Okay, he brings here a few more examples. I'm not going to go into that for the moment. The more we understand the way the world is, the more we understand why the Torah is it is a roadmap through reality. It's got these beautiful definitions. It is as if secular and scientific knowledge were the map and Torah was the route, right? In actual fact, philosophy defines the questions very well, but doesn't give answers. I'm sometimes, because I spent time studying philosophy in university, I'm sometimes asked by young men and women who are thinking, from boys and girls who are thinking of studying philosophy, whether I recommend it or not, right? So I'm not going. That's a complicated answer. It depends on the questioner, etc. But one point I do make regularly, and that is, don't study philosophy thinking that it's going to answer any of your questions about life, purpose of life, the value of life, and understanding of life. Philosophy is the best study for understanding the questions. Philosophy defines the questions of life, will deepen your understanding of the questions of life. And then when you want to know the answer, learn Torah. The Torah actually contains all the answers to all the questions of philosophy. The problem is that the Torah often doesn't ask the questions. It gives you the answer without asking the question. If you study philosophy, every course in philosophy I took were questions about the limits of human knowledge and about scientific methodology and about logic and about what can we know about God and metaphysics, and they just define. They have no answers. They have no answers, but it is an exercise in understanding the questions better. So what Rabbi Sachs is saying, we can learn Torah, which are simply the answers without the questions, and go deeper and deeper, and that's it, and we've got the answers. But the followers of the Rambam, right, want to follow the route of the chalon, of the window. The window is the window which brings in the other, brings in light from the outside. He says this view, articulated by Maimonides, was developed in the modern age in a variety of forms. Devotees of Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch call it Torah in Derech Eretz, Torah combined with general culture, right? So they validated the study of non-Jewish material on the basis of what they call Torah in Derech Eretz. In Yeshiva University, it came to be known as Torah and Mada. They used a slightly different punchline, Torah and Mada, Torah and science. The truth is that these two hashkafas are different. The Torah and Derech Eretz and the Torah and Mada models are very different from each other. Those of you who know anything about the geography of New York will know that both Yeshiva University and the Breuer community of Hirsch are in Washington Heights, about 100 yards away from each other. And there have often been great emotive debates between the two of them, that even though they both agree that secular subjects have a role to play in the education, in Jewish education, the Torah Derech Eretz presentation of Hirsch is much more pragmatic. In other words, you should learn worldly sciences in order to be able to function in the physical world, to have a career, to have a profession, to have a knowledgeable view about what's happening in this world. You should study Derech Eretz. But I don't believe that Hirsch, I don't think, believed that the study of philosophy and science helped you understand Torah. He felt these were two separate entities, two separate enterprises, which were good to develop sort of parallel to each other, but not because they interacted with each other. And then there is Torah or Mada, which is from the Yeshiva University, which is more what Rabbi Sachs is talking about. Torah or Mada is where the Mada can enhance the Torah. The Torah actually becomes better understood through the study. And together with the late Aaron Lichtenstein, I prefer, this is Rabbi Sachs says, Torah v'chochma, Torah and wisdom, because wisdom is a biblical category, but Torah and wisdom never became one of the top 10 phrases. So it's either Torah or Mada. Okay, I'm not going to go into that for the moment. So he says here, it was precisely Maimonides' breadth of knowledge of science, medicine, psychology, astronomy, philosophy, and logic, and many other fields that allowed him to be so creative in everything he wrote. From his letters to his commentary to the Mishnah Torah and the Moreh Nevuchim. Maimonides said things that many have sensed before, but no one expressed them so cogently and powerfully. He showed that it's possible to be utterly devoted to Jewish faith and law and yet be creative, right? Showing people spiritual and intellectual depths they had never seen before. That was his way of making a tzohar, a window for the table of the divine. So you can see that Rabbi Sachs personally is a devotee of Maimonides in this question, as indeed am I, but he's conceding that the majority of the Orthodox Jewish world does not go down that route. But these are two views, two schools of thought which exist side by side within the Torah, and they're reflected by the ambiguity in the word Zohar. So on the other hand, the Zohar, conceives of the Torah as a precious stone that gives light of itself and needs none from the outside. Its world is a closed system. Right? The view of Torah only is that the Torah is a completely coherent, internally coherent closed system, a very deep, passionate, moving, sustained search for the intimacy with the divine that dwells in the universe and within the human soul. And we don't need, thank you very much, any help from the Goyim in understanding the Torah. This is the view of the other. There are beautiful arguments. Look what he does here. He says what's important to know is that these two schools of thought. There are beautiful arguments for both interpretations, and in truth, we do not have to choose one over the other. I'm not sure I completely agree with him on that. I think one does, to a certain extent, have to choose one over the other. But what he means to say, I think, is that even when you choose your way, you don't have to invalidate the other way. You say, look, that's different. Like the Ramah wrote to the Marshal. My view is I follow the Rambam, study science and philosophy and everything, and Aristotle is for me a source of wisdom, which I incorporated my thinking. Right? That was the Ramah. Right? The Marshal said, Chas v'shalom, we don't need any of that. We are learning Torah, and we don't need any help from the Goyim. Thank you very much. But the Marshal, what for me was beautiful was the Marshal replying and saying, look, these are two equally valid approaches, right? And therefore, it doesn't have to mean that we are at odds with each other. We've just, and that's Rashi says, and the genius of Rabbi Sachs is to see that in a simple Rashi, where the whole of Rashi has only got about 5 or 6 words in it. Yesh omrim chalom, v'yesh omrim even tova. Right? Seems to be a simple debate on what Soha means in the Ark, and yet it touches upon an idea which is a phenomenally important idea within the Jewish world, has been so for thousands of years, and remains so to this day. And now, so I said to you in the beginning, this Dvar Torah has got 3 levels to it. So the first level is simply understanding that the word Teva doesn't just mean an ark, but it can mean also the word of Torah. The second level is to understand that it reflects on this very deep dispute about the validity of secular science, secular subjects. And then he says, recall, his final line is, recall that Chizkuni said that Noach had a precious stone for the dark days and a window for when the sun shone again. So he says the Chizkuni gave us a different model, that it depended on what was happening outside. So he says, he's giving us his final opinion. Something like that happened when it came to Torah also. During the dark days of persecution, Jewish mysticism flourished and Torah was illuminated from within, right? A bit like Shimon Bar Yochai in the cave, right? Who is fleeing persecution. And Torah is illuminated from within. During the benign days, benign here means during the happy days, right? When the world was more open to Jews, they had a window to the outside, and so emerged figures like Maimonides and Samson Raphael Hirsch. So what he's really ends up at this third stage of the Dvar Torah is saying that if we read the Chizkuni properly, it will depend on the general connection that we have with the world around us. In other words, remember that, for example, Rashi and the Bali Atosos were living in a fiercely anti-Semitic Catholic Europe, right? Many of the Rishonim of that generation suffered terribly in the hands of the Crusaders, and the world, the non-Jewish world of Rashi and Tosfos was incredibly hostile and murderous and filled with hatred. And therefore you couldn't open the window to let the light in, because if you opened the window, all that would come in would be hatred and hostility would come in. And therefore, he says, historical conditions often decided which of these two schools of thought became more prominent. In times like the times of the 16th, 17th century, with the spread of Kabbalah and the spread of the Torah-only philosophy, during those times, the non-Jewish world was immensely hostile. Right, the massacres of Chmielnicki and the blood libels and the persecutions, and they lived in a terrible time. They weren't in touch with an enlightened non-Jewish world. The Rambam was in touch with an enlightened non-Jewish world. So was Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, and so was the Ibn Ezra, and so was the Sforno. They all learned science and medicine and philosophy because they had a non-Jewish world around them where when they opened the window, the light came in. So he wants to finish off by saying that nowadays we live in a world, I believe that the challenge for our time is to open a series of windows so that the world can illuminate our understanding of Torah, and so the Torah may guide us as we seek to make our way through the world, full stop. That's the end of this. So I want you to get a feel for what's happened here. I think this is a little taste of Rabbi Sax's genius, right? That he has noted, we all know that there is this debate going on in the Jewish world. Anybody who's a student of the Jewish society over the ages knows that there's been the Torah-only approach, which completely invalidates and negates any secular subject. And then there's been the other approach, which says secular subjects are vital in order for us to develop our understanding and our wisdom and our brains and our understanding of life. The brilliance of Rabbi Sachs is to connect that debate with a seemingly simple discussion in Rashi on a seemingly simple word in the Pasuk, and to drill down into that word through Chazal and through the Rishonim to find there is an idea here, which if you read it covenantally, not just textually, you read it covenantally, what is it saying to us, tells us that there really are these options in Jewish life. And these options in Jewish life have guided different rabbonim and different yeshivas, different attitudes to Torah, have been shaped by whether or not you believe that secular subjects can enhance Torah life, or whether you believe that secular learning is a danger to Torah life. And this debate is still very much raging, I would say, among educators and different sources of Jewish education in the world we live in today. And Rabbi Sachs connected it with the window of Noah's Ark. And that was my Dvar Torah for today I wanted to share with you. And if you like, you can unmute yourselves now, and I'm willing to take a few comments or questions if anybody wishes to say anything.
Rabbi Kimche, can you hear?
One at a time.
Rabbi Kimche, can you hear me? Okay. Can you hear me? Yes, you can hear me. For some reason I can't hear you, but
unmute yourself, Rabbi Kimche. You're muted.
Now you can hear me.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Rabbi Kimche, you and I learned in Yeshivas Kol Torah, and I think we both came there in 1968. I learned there until 1971, and in 1971, I traveled back to Baltimore, and from 1971 to 1978, I attended the yeshiva that your children have attended more recently, 7 years. So I'm sure that the yeshiva has gone through some changes, but I have to tell you something about what was the very clearly expressed yeshiva attitude about the boys going to college in the evening. These remarks I'm saying come out of personal and public conversations with the first Rosh Yeshiva, Rav Yitzchak Halevi Ruderman.
Rabbi Ruderman, yes.
Rabbi Ruderman. The second Rosh Yeshiva, his son-in-law.
I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to be a bit brief.
Okay, so basically, they conveyed one thought, that the yeshiva never advocated that the boys go to college in the evening, ever, but rather that it was a b'di'evid. That was the word they all used. It was a b'di'evid, b'shas hadchak, and this comes from Rav Weinberg.
What you're saying is the yeshiva tolerated it rather than advocated it.
Yes.
Right. Okay. I accept there are lots of different shades of gray in this debate. There are people who will completely reject it. There are people who will tolerate it. There are people who will advocate it. And I would say that there's a whole spectrum of attitudes toward combining the secular pursuits with the Torah knowledge. But I thank you, Avram. I didn't want to depict Ner Yisrael Baltimore in the wrong light. But I would say to you, even within Ner Yisrael Baltimore, because I've been there many times and spoken many times to the Rabbonim, the yeshivas and everything, even among the Rabbonim there is a variety of different views.
I'm certain.
Many do actively encourage the boys to go to university. Others absolutely do not. So it remains, I think the debate that Rabbi Sachs describes is true even there. Yes, anybody else want to make a comment?
I have a few questions. First of all, it's very interesting you talked about word teva. We're all part of this shul. Rabbi E.T.L. Goldvick gave a very interesting Devar Torah on the word teva, that the dimensions of the teva.
Okay, if you don't mind, Judith, I'm just going to take very brief comments now.
No, what I wanted to ask you, were there other, see, there's one thing that the atmosphere of going to a secular college and being around Goyim and all of that is a problem. So a lot of things have been created, like Yeshiva University.
Let me just relate to that point for one moment. And you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right that is a secondary issue. The primary issue is there any value to secular subjects? What you're saying is even were we to concede, even if we do concede that there is a value, even if there is a value to secular subjects, the next question is, once you go on campus and you are subjected to the hefkerus and the pritzas and all the negative forces on campus, will that really, are you going to be able spiritually to survive that? That's a second question. You might be interested to know that the Maharal Miprad, who was writing 500 years ago, right, who personally knew quite a few of the Renaissance scientists and astronomers, and he felt like the Rambam, that it was vital to know science. The Maharal was very big on science. He writes, he says, I urge you to learn science, but don't go and learn with the professors in the university, because they are all apikorasim and mushchosim. They are immoral and atheistic people, and you might be influenced by them, but read their books. That's what Maharal writes. Read their books. In other words, learn it at arm's length. Right? So
exactly, because that's
Chachma
Goyim Tami,
500 years ago. So therefore, the question is much more complex. Of course, it is much more complex, and it's a subject for a whole series of talks. All the different shades of grey in this debate. But certainly, Rabbi Sachs is completely correct to say that there is a fundamental initial question that has to be answered. Is secular subjects beneficial at all to our study of Torah, or is it a waste of time? That's okay. Yes,
just one brief question.
Sure.
would you also say, would you agree that there's actually a third aspect, perhaps, to
Go on.
the two dimensions that you've presented, and that is the fact, and perhaps you would also agree, I mean, the way I see it is that it's not just, is the Torah self-sufficient for or do we need the outside light? But I see exemplified in the life, for example, of Rabbi Sachs, Zichrono Livracha, of taking the light of Torah out into the darkness, which is that not another?
Okay, you're absolutely right that if we want to describe, if we're giving a shir about Rabbi Sachs did exactly what you just now described. But that's not relevant to this Dvar Torah about the Teva. But however, you're absolutely right. It was because Rabbi Sachs had such immense knowledge of secular subjects. And I just want to tell you, by the way, he drove us all crazy that he had the ability to take some of the most difficult books in psychology and social sciences and philosophy and to sit down and in one reading, he completely devoured, digested the book. And for the rest of his life, he could quote from it and compare it and analyze it. And he was a genius. It wasn't fair, right? He had abilities that outshone all his colleagues in the intellectual field. He was just an amazing genius at so many different levels. And because he had that, he was able to sit with the Richard Dawkins and the scientists who were militant atheists, and he could discuss with them science and teach them why they're wrong, right? Why they're wrong, and present Torah. He could sit with Buddhists and teach them Judaism and discuss it. Because he was able to go out there, he could sit with prime ministers and presidents and discuss political theory and social issues with full knowledge of all the books that have been written on the subject. And he had immense knowledge in so many fields. And that made him a wonderful ambassador for Judaism. That's what you're talking about. To be able to go out there into the non-Jewish world and represent Jewish life, there are only a handful of people in each generation who are able at all to do that, right? But Rabbi Sachs did it in an exemplary way. And of course, in order to do that, you do need the knowledge of secular knowledge. Anybody else want to make a comment?
Final comment?
Final comment?
Thank you. Thank you so
I
much.
hope you enjoyed the Shia. I tried to encompass a big idea